is about bees, well, when you're really interested in orchids. So normally I have a long introduction where I say, well, most people know honeybees, and honeybees are not native to Australia, of course. Now I'm going to skip that a bit. Of course, I will show you the fantastic beauty of bees, because these are all South Australian bees, and the middle one, no doubt you know, this is the blue-banded bee, one of the most conspicuous species in Adelaide. The beautiful blue one on top is a parasitic bee, parasitic to the blue-banded bee, so it puts its egg into the blue-banded bee, and the larva that comes out eats the egg of the blue-banded and then eats the pollen supplies. So it's really, it hasn't got the wherewithal to collect pollen itself. It's on top there is a teddy bear bee. That is one we don't have in this state, but we've got something similar. That one that really looks like a wasp is one of 350 species of Euryglossine bee. Euryglossine is an Australian subfamily, and nearly all of them specialize on eucalypts. And when you stand under a eucalypt in summer and it's flowering and you see the air shimmering, that's often them in their thousands. This one here is also quite famous because it occurs in bee hotels now and then, so it's a resin bee. And of course this is the green carpenter bee that I talked about last time, which is not doing very well on Kangaroo Island after the fires. Now, of course, in total there are now about 1,800 known species in Australia. I think about 300 around Adelaide. But we think that there's still about 600 to be described. So we're still busy finding new species. With so many species, there's of course huge variation. There's variation in size. This is one of the largest bees of Australia, and on its wing there is one of the smallest bees. It's not a young, it's an adult. It doesn't grow any bigger than that. There's variation in how they collect pollen. They can collect it on their belly, they can graze it off the plants, such as that on the eucalypt does. They can collect it wet, which is what the stingless bees do, which we also don't have here because it's too cold, it's a tropical species. Or they have hairs all over it themselves, collect the pollen and put it in their hairs on their legs. That's what most of them do. There's variation in nesting substrate. I'll go very quickly through that. They can nest in twigs, in hollows that they dig out themselves, or in solid wood, like the carpenter bees do. They nest in mud brick. They make their own nest. We've just described 71 new species in this subgenus, which make their own cups from resin to rear their brood in. Really adorable, I think. But 70% of them nest in the ground, and you would see a little glow, and for the rest you would see nothing, unless you see a bee going in and out generally. But they have got things in common. They're officially wasps, but they're wasps that feed their offspring pollen and nectar. And this is what happens in a bee nest. This is the species I did my PhD on a very long time ago. They collect pollen and nectar, make a loaf of it, put an egg on top, close this, generally, not always, and then it's called a brood cell. And in the brood cell, the larva hatches and eats the pollen, and that's when you get larvae that have eaten the pollen, and you get on top there a white pupa. And you look a bit later, and the white pupas turn black, and the larvae have all turned into pupae. Generally the mother then dies, or she has died already, and the adults come out the next year. Sometimes it happens differently. Studying this species because there's overlap between mother and daughter generations, and they've got interactions and they fight for dominance, and it all gets very exciting. And that's a bit different, but most bees are solitary. They produce their offspring and die, and the offspring comes out the next year, often in tune with the plants that they rely on. Now, not surprisingly, most bees are photographed collecting pollen on flowers because that's what they eat. Without flowers, they can't be there. So this makes me one of the happiest researchers in the world, because I get to go out when the weather is nice and when the flowers are out, and to beautiful spots often. Now, but I was here to talk about orchids. Of course, these bees go to flowers where they can find rewards. But orchids can also offer rewards. And like all flowers, they don't necessarily rely on bee pollination. Some orchids in the world, many orchids in the world, rely on bird pollination. They will produce nectar to attract the birds. Those relying on bat pollination will produce nectar. And there are Australian species that produce nectar. This is a bit of a vague picture, but it is Calodenia rigida, and there is a hoverfly, and hoverflies do collect the nectar from this species. But in some genera, some do and some don't produce nectar, so it's not that fixed really, or some only produce a little bit. If you look at the helmet orchids or the greenhoods, they are pollinated by fungus gnats, and yes, they do produce a little bit of nectar. And the helmet orchid then lures the gnat into the flower and puts pollinia on top of them. And I came across a beautiful story because I know about bees, right? So I thought, okay, I'll read up a bit on the orchid bees, which are South American, which I know well from a behavioral point of view, but not so much about the orchids. Well, the male collects perfumes from orchids and use the perfumes to attract females. Okay, so here you have one of those males, and it's got a groove on its leg there where it puts the perfume in. And perfumes are, amongst others, produced by bucket orchids, and I was fascinated by this story, so I'll tell it. Maybe you know it well already, but I just loved it. So the bucket orchid produces this perfume and also leaks that into a bucket. And the bee goes to where the perfume is produced, tries to collect it, but it's slippery there, and he falls in the bucket. The bucket is quite deep, so he needs to paddle. He can't get a hold, so he paddles a bit, and then he finds a ledge. And the ledge is about here. And he can't get up because it's too slippery, but there is a little tunnel here, and he can see light at the end of the tunnel, so, okay, he'll crawl in, right? He fits in it quite well. But then what happens is, when the bee is halfway in the tunnel contracts, and the bee is stuck. And then the plant puts glue on the bee and pollinia on the bee, and keeps this contraction up for about 45 minutes for it all to dry. And then after 45 minutes it opens again and releases the bee. Now, isn't that fantastic? But the bee can't really help himself, because the man that has the best smells and most smells attracts the woman. So he needs to visit more orchids, and he will pollinate because of that. Okay, so I thought that a really beautiful story. And there you have the pollinia on top of one of those bees. And of course, I am originally from Holland, and I was well aware of the interactions between lots of bees and orchids there, mainly orchids. And here you have one of those examples. Fantastic. Look at it. It's a bee. It's got hairy legs. It's got antennae there and eyes. And it produces the irresistible smell of a female bee that hasn't mated, because female bees that haven't mated produce a different smell from female bees that have mated. So males can smell the difference. It produces this irresistible smell, and what you get is a pseudo-copulation. So the male really thinks this is a female, mates with the flower, and gets the pollinia put on. And of course, sex is a really important drive in nature, so with the next flower he can't help himself, he'll do it again. It's not only bees though. Here's one for a wasp. This one, of course, the shiny bit there reflects the wings of the wasp, which is fantastic. But there's not only bees, there's flies doing the same thing. And it leads to a fantastic variation in colours and shapes of orchids imitating females of different species, which I find really, really amazing. Of course, we have got similar things here, because we've got the thin-eared wasp and the hammer. Is it hammerhead orchid or hammer orchid? I don't know. Anyway, so the thin-eared wasp tries to mate with the orchid, and different species of orchids target different species of thin-eared wasps. And in doing that, they transmit their pollinia. Now, the thin-eared wasp is a very special thing, because the female thin-eared wasp, which this represents, she cannot fly, so she crawls up a stalk and waits for a male to come by to pick her up. And then they go to flowers together. I often catch pairs of flowers, and she feeds and he feeds. And then she is dropped off at a good spot where she can find, for instance, a bee nest to lay her eggs, to eat from the bee larvae, because that's what they do. They're wasps. Wasp larvae eat meat. Bee larvae eat pollen and nectar. So this is a really, I think, beautiful story, and how those shapes evolve and those smells evolve is really magnificent. But not all orchids have rewards or promise rewards. You've got this. You've got these cheetahs that cheat with sex, but you've also got cheetahs that promise floral rewards. They promise nectar. Now, this is not an orchid, but this is a very well-known example of a plant that promises beautiful nectar. It smells gorgeous in the evening. We all know it, frangipani. And it doesn't give out any reward. It just smells beautifully, and it attracts inexperienced fingered moths. And it does that they are only susceptible to it for a little while, and then they know, oh, there's nothing to get there. They've done experiments in greenhouses where they released this inexperienced fingered moth, and after a few hours they weren't interested anymore. They knew they weren't there. So these plants rely on large numbers of inexperienced insects coming out. And one of the examples from Finland is the early marsh orchid, where I thought, that imitates a hyacinth, but no, because hyacinths have never occurred in Finland. They're not native there. It doesn't imitate any known plant, as far as they know, but it does attract. It's got no reward. It doesn't mimic a food plant. It relies on inexperienced bees. because bees, like most insects, learn what's edible and what's not, there should be a large number of them, and indeed these rely on the first brood of bumblebees coming out. So queens start early in late winter, solitarily, and then there's a first batch coming out, and these plants rely on those bees to get pollinated. Okay, so there's a lot of food mimics in Australia as well. So these are orchids. Telemitras and sunopers are a really good example of it, where you have got a plant that mimics a plant that is rewarding. And they do that better than indicators by the visuals, but because we see plant flowers differently from how bees see them. Bees don't see any red in the spectrum, they see ultraviolet. And they've got really strong, good sense of ultraviolet. So it's very possible that these two here, which look superficially a bit like each other to us, that bees, well, they might not see the anthers there because they're red, so they might just ignore them. But it's very possible that they reflect UV in exactly the same way, and that they therefore look very much alike. And then they could also smell alike, right? But while this offers rewards in pollen, all these plants are pollen plants, they don't produce nectar, this offers the bee generally nothing. Some Telemitra species do produce nectar, but generally it's very little, and also it can be solid, and bees can't cope with solid nectar. Flies can, but bees cannot, so then they wouldn't get any reward. There's many that are thought to imitate, say, a guild of flowers, so not one exactly, but a number of them that bees then, they make mistakes. So those food mimic guilds, the orchids that do that rely on bees making a mistake. But that mistake is rather unpleasant for a bee, really, because it gets something glued on it that it can't get off, and it is not very nice. So because bees learn, they would easily learn to avoid those plants if they could. If there were only orchids there, they would go there once and then decide there's nothing for me there and not go there anymore, right? So the orchid, for pollination, relies on the presence of the real thing, right? Of the plant that is rewarding. And that is really important to know. So bees learn, and because of that, the real deal should be present. Otherwise the orchid doesn't get pollinated very well. And it's also important to realize that bees need food. As I often say, flying is high-octane business. You can't fly if you can't find nectar. So bees need nectar to find nectar in that area. Now, all of these plants, the real deal, they don't produce nectar. So, and that is a real issue. They're pollen-only plants, and 3 of them, this one, that one, and that one, are buzz-pollinated plants, as it's called. And I will show you a bit about buzz pollination, because it's important to realize how many plants actually do that. So, in buzz-pollinated plants, you've got a plant, and the pollen is not outside to be collected. Plants have this problem, right? They want their pollen to be transported, but they don't want their pollen to be easily accessible and eaten. So they protect it in very different ways and rely on a subsection of insects to transport it. And buzz pollination is one of those strategies. The pollen is inside and the plant needs to be shaken like a salt and pepper shaker to get the pollen out. Now, tomato is a buzz pollinated plant, and this is what that looks like. Okay, there's no sound with it, that's a pity, because it goes bzzz, bzzz, and you hear it in the background here, and then the bee will return and it will do bzzz, and it shakes the pollen out. Yeah, there it is again. Now, I had a visitor a few years ago with a slow motion camera, and he filmed that in slow motion, and so I'm going to show you one single buzz in slow motion. It's only that, and what you will see is the bee landing on the tomato and taking it. We thought they tense their wings and do bzzz, but no, they don't. They start to tap from the side to shake that pollen out, and they shake it onto their belly, and this is all this one bzzz, and it's actually a staggering 320 hertz, which is 320 of those taps per second. So there's probably different sets of muscles involved in this, because one set of muscle cannot do it that quickly. So I found it really, really fascinating the way they do this. Now, I always have problems filling this time because this one lasts so long in slow motion, but very soon it will decide. And this is a short tap because those flowers were fairly empty. So here it goes, and now it will brush its pollen into its legs. Okay, so in Australia, a fair few plants are buzz pollinated. So all your Thycernotuses, your fringe lilies, all your Hibbertias or guinea flowers, the Atropodiums, Dianella, you see it looks like anthers, but in actual fact up there is a little brown tip, and that's where the pollen comes out. The Senna or Cassia, the Tetratheca or Black-eyed Susan, and all solanums are all buzz pollinated. Only a selection of bees can do that. Honeybees cannot do that. And to my surprise, a lot of orchids seem to mimic buzz pollinated plants. Now, the importance is here that buzz pollinated plants never produce nectar. They don't. They just have this pollen, and they don't produce nectar. So whenever you have a buzz pollinated plant, you also need a nectar plant next to it. If you want blue-banded bees in your garden to pollinate your tomatoes, you're much better off having some nectar plants for them as well that flower at the same time, because that will attract them and keep them going. This buzzing is also energetically costly, right? So the message here is those food mimic guides, they rely on mistaken identity. Bees learn, so the real deal should be there, but the real deal only produces pollen, and therefore we also need nectar plants. And without that, those bees are still not there. So there's a whole ecosystem where the pollination of orchids depend on the other plants. Right? And the fun thing is that it's not only the food mimics that require other plants to be there, because even the thinid wasps need nectar, right? So without nectar plants, even many of the sexually deceptive orchids wouldn't really get that much attraction, maybe. Now, I have been asked for years, well, what should I plant for bees? And I made a guide, with useful plants for bees. You can find it by searching Food for Bees Burnside, because they put it on their website. It's got a bit of an overview of when does it flower, does it produce pollen and nectar, is it a buzz-pollinated plant, which are in there. It's got tips for gardening, and also some things to explain where bees nest and how you can garden and keep the nests in the ground happy and things like that. This QR code will also be at the last slide, so you can take it up then. There are also more official guides. I'm at the moment writing 3 of them, but I've already written 2 for South Australia, and they are produced by the Ween Bee Foundation. They're called Powerful Pollinator Guides, and they tell you what's good for flies, butterflies, bees, and it's always local native plants. We might, with climate change, have to have a look at plants that have a bit northerly distribution, more northerly distribution, because it's likely that some of our plants won't last the distance with climate change, so we need to maybe adapt before we lose everything. But yeah, these are good sources for information about what to plant. And when I write these, many people, there are 38 or 39 of these guides for all over Australia already. But when I write these, I have particular attention for specialists, because specialist bees are the ones who are doing it tough. And there are very many bee species that rely on a single plant species. And they are, of course, very vulnerable. If that plant species is not there, they cannot be there. And examples are, well, I think 600-700 species rely on Myrtaceae. It's enormous. That is enormous. But there's also a Banksia bee. It's quite threatened in Adelaide. Last time I saw it was in Aldinga Scrub, and I hope it's still there, but a lot of the Banksia marginata didn't survive. So I'm curious to see if it is. We need to plant it in the city, right, to keep that going. There's Pesunia bees. They feed their larvae only pollen from Pesunia. The Banksia bee feeds its larvae only pollen from Banksia. So they rely completely on that presence. We've got species specializing on Wahlenbergia or Malva, and lots of species in the arid zone relying on Eremophilas completely. But there's one in the hills that I've been paying a lot of attention to recently, and that is the Golden Pea Bee. Looks a bit like a honeybee, but it's got gorgeous gold silvery bands, and the males look a bit more attractive. The males, this is the male, that is again the female. The male will collect nectar, from other pea species. You will see it there. The female specializes on the Visia. And the larva, so that's the bitter peas, the larvae of the Golden Pea Bee only eat pollen from the Visia. So that's, they're still in the hills, but there are not many in the suburbs because people don't plant the Visia in their garden. And they're active between August and October when the Visia flowers, and they nest in the ground. But I did plant the Visia, this one, Leptophila, in my garden and added to it every year. And I live in Eden Hills, so it's suburbia. And after 7 years, I saw my first bee. And then I thought, if I can do it, many people can. And there's still along Brown Hill Creek and all that, so and up in Bel Air. So I designed this project where I would give groups let me see, the peas, and say, here, plant these somewhere, and they will come. And there's a big project in Brownhill Creek with schools, and they've planted those Davisias all along, and they're also planting them at their school areas, which are close by. And that's a project that's really taken off. Now we've got 3 species of bitter peas in this area: the leafless bitter pea, the narrow-leaf bitter pea, and the gorse bitter pea. The middle one is the most attractive one for a garden, so I focused largely on that one. It doesn't really matter, and the leafless bitter pea is a bit more in the north. It likes a bit of sand. But anyway, so this worked really well. It's nearly at the end of the project. But we planted a lot of Davisias, and schools did, councils did, Friends of Parks groups did, and I'm now doing the last things, distributing the information boards and some extra plants for them to plant next to each other so that that information lives on. And we also made a short film, and I'll have a QR code at the end for that. But there is an additional story to this, because the donkey orchid mimics peat. And, this is the wrong way. Okay, so it is probably a guild mimic, so it mimics a large number of peas, but they say in the literature that it also mimics Pultonea, which is the one down the bottom, and I have my doubts. I think it largely mimics the Davisias. And so when you are in an area where there are Davisias and there are donkey orchids, and Bella National Park has a number of these places where you can find them both, what you see is this. Very often, very many especially of the males, the females too, but especially the males, a lot of them have pollinia of the donkey orchid on their faces. And so this is an important pollinator of the donkey orchid, and we need to have Davisia close to the donkey orchid, therefore, to get that pollination going. So that's more or less what I was going to tell. My general take-home message is very simple and doesn't need any pictures. It is please plant bee food. It's important. And when you do that, it's not only the bees that will say thank you, because flowers are important for all flying insects. And so insect-eating birds, especially the flying insect, those that eat flying insects, will be grateful as well. Not only that, the buzz-pollinated plants, when you plant a variety of nectar sources, will also be very happy, and so will the donkey orchid. So I thank you for inviting me. I love to talk about bees, so it was a joy to get this together, and I leave you with QR codes for my plants, the bee hotels, and for the PB video, which is 2 minutes, which you can watch if you like. I'm putting on my best David Attenborough voice there.
Gordon.
Is Platylobium one of those flowers that will attract bees? Because I've seen Diurus orientis sort of almost around a clump of those.
Yeah, they could. Yeah, the problem is I don't know how important orchid pollination is for orchids, because of course they also have bulbs. And so I assume they can propagate in different ways. But Platylobium is quite attractive to a lot of, I mostly see generalist native bees on there. But they would also pollinate. I found pollinia of Diurus on honeybees as well. I mean, it's not only the PB, but it is quite dominant where they are. But yeah, Platylobium could also be in the guild that is mimicked. Yeah.
And the feral bees a problem for native bees?
Yeah, they are. So the feral bees are a problem for native bees because they are very abundant here, feral honeybees. They take a lot of pollen and nectar out of the system. And they do that not only when there are eucalypts in flower and there's enough for everybody, they also do it when hardly anything is flowering, right? And they have a warm hive, so they can start when it's 13 degrees. Our native bees start to wake up when it's 20, 21, and by that time a lot of the floral resources are gone. So I am one of the ones who is really happy about the varroa mite coming into our country because what will happen is we will see a huge decline in feral honeybees. And I'm the first to say we need honeybees for the pollination of our crops. I've worked enough with that to know that without honeybees we won't have apples, almonds, you name it. But we don't need them in nature, and we don't need them in conservation areas. This is the problem with the honeybee industry. So the honeybee industry gets about 75-80% of its revenue from honey. And 75% of that is eucalypt honey, and they want into the conservation areas to produce their honey. And this is quite horrible because they leave swarms and they repopulate, they will repopulate those feral hives again in doing that, and they will get knocked back again with thanks to the varroa mite, but it won't be like there is nothing or we will never revert to something pristine where there are no honeybees. In the arid zone, honeybees often can't be there because they need water, and so we see a lot of fantastic bee biodiversity in arid zones.
Any more questions?